welcome back. Today we're ready to read chapter 2 of our Hatchet series, which I'm enjoying. Chapter 1 was so intense. I can't wait to find out what's going to happen to Brian as he either figures out that he needs to call for help or he needs to fly the plane suddenly. So starting with chapter 2 today. For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working, he would see what had happened and he would do nothing. It was as if his hands and his arms were lead. Lead would be something very heavy. Then he looked for ways for it not to have happened, to be asleep. His mind screamed at the pirates, just be asleep. And your eyes will open, and your hands will take the controls, and your feet will move the pedals. But it didn't happen. The pilot did not move, except that his hand rolled over on his neck and possibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of a turbulence. The plane. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew as if nothing had ever happened. He had to do something. He had to do something. But he didn't know what to do. Help. He had to help. He stretched out one hand toward the pilot and saw that his fingers were trembling, touched the pilot on the chest, and he didn't want to do. His hands were there, procedures. He could do mouth-to-mouth on victims for heart attacks, push their chests, CPR. But he did not know how to do it, and in any case, couldn't do it with the pilot, who was sitting on the seat, still strapped into his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest, and he could feel nothing. No heartbeat. Oof. No rise. No fall or rise of breathing. That meant that the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Brian said, that he didn't know what to do or who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again and hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. It did not dive, but the nose did go down slightly, and the down angle increased in speed, and he knew that this angle was a slight angle down. He would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, and where before he could only see sky. He had to fly this plane somehow. Had to fly this plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, and beyond anything he could do, he had to at least try to fly the plane. He turned back to the seat facing the front and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. If he pulled back on the stick to raise the plane, he knew that from reading. You always pulled back on the wheel. So he gave it a tug and he slid it back towards him easily. Too easily. The plane with increased speed came from a tilt down, swooped eagerly up, and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, this time too far, and the plane's nose went below the horizon and the engine speed increased in the shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up. Too far, but not as violently as before. Then down a bit too much, and then up again, and then down a bit, and then up again, very easily. And in front of the engine, caroling settled. When he had it aimed at the horizon, he seemed to be steady. He had the wheel where it was and let out a breath, which he had been holding the entire time. And he tried to think about, what do I do next? It was clear, a blue sky with fluffy bits of clouds here and there when he looked out the window, and for a moment hoping to see something, a town, a village, but there was nothing. Just the green of the trees, the endless green of trees, and lakes scattered below, and more thickly as the plane flew where? He was flying, but he didn't know where. He had no idea where he was flying. He looked at the dashboard of the plane and studied it a bit. All the dials, and hoped that he could get some help. Hoped that he could find at least a compass. But it was all so confusing. A jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display at the top center of the dashboard and the number 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath there were dials with lines that seemed to indicate where the winds were doing and ripping and roaring, and one dial where the needle pointed towards the number 70, which he thought might be the altimeter. The device had told him his height above the ground, or maybe above sea level. He didn't know. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, and he couldn't remember what or where or anything about them. Slightly to the left and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and 2 knobs. His eyes had passed over it 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in the letters on the top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in metal, and it hit him. Finally, this was the radio. The radio, of course, he had to use the radio. That's what the pilot had been doing, and it hadn't been hit that way. He obviously couldn't bring it back to himself to say the pilot was dead, or couldn't think it. He had been trying to use the radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped to his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot. He had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot so that he would be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot. He did not want to reach for him, but he had to. He had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally and smoothly. All right, he thought. Now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset and did it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull it to get it loose. When he pulled his elbow, he bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the pilot's plane started down on the shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back too hard again, and the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it back under control. When things had settled down again, he pulled out the mic and once more, at last jerk of cord free. It took him another second or two to put the headset in his own head and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it and had seen him depress the switch on his belt, so Brian pushed the switch and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his own breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening to this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but nothing except his own breathing. Panic came then. He had been afraid. He had been stopped with terror at what was happening. But now panic came, and he began to scream into the microphone. Scream over and over, "Help! Somebody help me! I'm on this plane, and I don't know what to do. I don't know! I don't know!" And he started crying, and with the screams, and crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down and then back up. But again, he heard nothing but the sound of his own sobs in the microphone. His own screams mocking him and coming into his ears, the microphone. Awareness cut into him that he had used a CB radio at his uncle's pickup once, and we had to turn on the mic switch off to hear anybody else, so he reached to the belt and released the switch. For a second, all he heard was the swoosh of the empty airwaves, and then through the noise, static, he heard a voice. "Whoever is calling on this radio set, I repeat, please, switch your mic switch. You're covering me. You're covering me. Over." It stopped, and Brian hit his mic switch. I hear you. I hear you. This is me." He released the switch. "Roger, I have you now." The voice was very faint and breaking up. "Please state your difficulty and direction or location that you are going, and say over to signal the end of the transmission. Over." Please make my difficulty, Brian thought. Good grief, my difficulty. I'm in a plane with a pilot who is, he can't fly it, and I don't know how to fly it. Help me! Help! And he turned his mic off without ending the transmission properly. There was a moment's hesitation before the answer. "Your signal is breaking up, and I've lost most of it. Understand, pilot, you can't fly. Correct? Over." Brian could barely hear him now. Heard mostly noise and static. "That's right, I can't fly. The plane is flying now, and I don't know how much longer. Over." "Lost signal. Your location, please. Flight number, location. Over." "I don't know my flight number or my location. I don't know anything. I told you that. Over." He waited now. There was nothing. Once for a second. He thought he had heard a break in the noise and some part of a word, but it was just static. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. 10 minutes, and then the plane roared and Brian listened but heard nothing. Then he hit the switch again. I do not know the flight number. My name is Brian Robinson, and we left Hampton, New York, headed for the Canadian oil fields to visit my father. I do not know how to fly an airplane, and the pilot... He let go of his mic. His voice was starting to rattle, and he felt as if he might start screaming any second. He took a deep breath. Is there anybody listening who can help me fly a plane? Please answer. Again, he released the mic, but he heard nothing but the hissing of noise in a headset. After a half hour of listening and repeating the cry to help, he tore the headset off in frustration, and he threw it to the floor. It all seemed so hopeless, and even if he did get somebody, what could anybody do? Tell him to be careful? All was so hopeless. He tried to figure out the dials again, and he thought he might know which was speed, and it was the lighted number that read 160. But he didn't know if it was the actual miles an hour or kilometers, or if it just meant how fast the plane was moving through the air and not over the ground. He knew airspeed was different from ground speed, but not by much. Parts of books he had read about flying came to him. How wings worked and how the propellers worked and pulled the plane through the sky, and simple things that just couldn't help him now. Nothing could help him now. A half hour passed and he picked up his headset and tried again. It was, he knew, the end of all he had, but there was no answer. He felt like a prisoner, kept in a small cell, and was hurting through the sky as though he had thought to be 160 miles an hour headed. He didn't know where, just headed somewhere until... And there it was. Until what? Until he ran out of fuel? When the plane ran out of fuel, it would go down. Period. Or he could pull the throttle out and make it go down now. He had seen the pilot push the throttle into increased speed. If he pulled the throttle back out, the engine would slow down and the plane would go down. Those were his choices. He could wait for the plane to run out of gas and fall, or he could push the throttle in and make it happen sooner. If he waited for the plane to run out of fuel, he would go further, but he didn't know which way he was moving. When the pilot had jerked, he had moved the plane, but Brian could not remember how much, or if it had come back from the original course. Since he didn't know the original course anyway, he could only guess at to which display might be the compass, and the reading was 342. He did not know where he had been or where he was going, so it didn't make much difference anyways, if he went down now or if he waited. Everything in him rebelled against stopping the engine and falling now. He had a vague feeling that it was wrong to keep heading the plane as if it was heading in that direction, a feeling that he might be going off in the wrong direction, but he could not bring himself to stop the engine and fall. Now he was safe, or safer than if he went down, and the plane was flying. He was still breathing when the engine stopped and he would go down. So he left the plane running, holding altitude, and kept trying the radio. He worked out a system. Every 10 minutes, by the small clock built into the dashboard, he tried to radio with a simple message. I need help. Is there anyone listening to me? In the times between transmissions, he tried to prepare himself for what he knew was coming. When he ran out of fuel, the plane would start to go down. He guessed that without the propeller pulling, he would not have to push the nose down to keep the plane flying. He thought he may have to read somewhere that it was just come to him. Either way, it made sense. He would have to push the nose down to keep flying speed, and then just before he hit, he would have to pull the nose back up so the plane as much as possible. It all made sense. Glide down, then slow the plane and hit. Hit. He would have been clearing as he went down. The problem was that he hadn't seen one clearing since they started flying over this forest. Some swamps, but there were trees scattered through them. No roads, no trails, no clearings, just the lakes. And it came to him that he would have to use a lake for a landing. If he went down in the trees, he was certain to die. The trees would tear the plane to pieces as it went through them. He would have to come down in a lake. No, on the edge of a lake. He would have to come down near the edge of a lake, try to slow the plane down as much as possible just before he hit the water. Easy to say, he thought, but hard to do. Impossible to do. He repeated the radio call 17 times at 10-minute intervals, working on what he thought he would do in between transmissions. Once more, he reached over to the pilot and touched him on the face, but the skin was cold, hard, death cold. And Brian turned back to the dashboard. He did what he could, and he tightened his seatbelt and positioned himself, rehearsed mentally again and again what the procedure would be. When the plane ran out of gas, he would hold the nose down, and he would head for the nearest lake or try to fly the plane into the water. That's how he thought of it. Kind of fly the plane into the water. And just before it hit, he would pull back on the wheel and slow the plane to reduce the impact. Over and over in his mind, he ran the pictures of how he would do it. The plane running out of gas and flying the plane onto the water. The crash from pictures he had seen on television, he tried to visualize it. He tried to be ready, but between the 17th and 18th radio transmissions without warning, the engine coughed, roared violently for a second, and then died, and there was a sudden silence cut only by the sound of the wind milling propeller and the wind